Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all who are joining this webinar from across the world. I'm glad that people are tuning in from various countries, including from within Ethiopia, to this important conversation titled Understanding the Tigray-Ethiopia Peace Process. My name is Samuel Gebru. I'm an American whose family is from the Tigray region of Ethiopia. I've engaged on US-Ethiopia issues for over 17 years in various capacities. And since the start of the war in Tigray 2 years ago, I've exclusively worked to advocate for peace, relief, and accountability in Tigray, throughout Ethiopia, and in the Horn of Africa. Ethiopia is in what some would say political, economic, and social turmoil. It's a country with multiple armed conflicts of varying sizes and with multiple armed and political actors with varying interests. The war in Tigray can be described in various layers. It's a constitutional fight. It's a boundary dispute. It's a fight between former colleagues. It's a fight that the United Nations has said consists of credible allegations of war crimes on all sides and crimes against humanity by the Ethiopian government. It's a geopolitical fight that concerns the Horn of Africa, the Red Sea arena, and beyond. And most importantly, it's a fight that has cost hundreds of thousands of lives in Tigray and beyond. A fight that has destroyed communities, ended friendships, intensified fear and hatred, and significantly harmed the economy of Tigray and wider Ethiopia. 2 days ago, on Wednesday, November 2nd, negotiators from the federal government of Ethiopia and the Tigray People's Liberation Front concluded 10 days of intense discussions in South Africa, facilitated by the African Union and observed by the United States of America, the United Nations, and the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, which is the Horn of Africa's regional intergovernmental organization. The product of these talks is a cessation of hostilities agreement that elicited strong praise and condemnation, and perhaps has left even more people confused and worried. This is not the first time Ethiopian and Tigrayan political and military negotiators have met, but this is the most serious conversation so far. Joining us today to discuss this peace process, the 2-year war in Tigray, and the prospects for credible, inclusive, and permanent peace in Tigray and throughout Ethiopia are 3 fantastic individuals with enormous experience on these topics and beyond. Alex de Waal is a research professor at Tufts University's Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy and the executive director of the World Peace Foundation, which was founded in 1910 with a mission to provide intellectual leadership for peace. Susan Stigant is the director of Africa programs at the United States Institute of Peace, a federal institution founded in 1984 and funded exclusively by the United States Congress to advance the nonviolent prevention and mitigation of deadly conflict abroad. Joshua Meservey is an Africa Research Fellow at the Davis Institute for National Security and Foreign Policy at the Heritage Foundation, an American conservative public policy research and educational think tank founded in 1973 and among the most influential policy organizations in the United States. This webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded to YouTube in a few hours. We recognize that the ongoing peace process is fluid and may warrant a second part to this discussion in perhaps a week or 2 as we further understand and analyze what's going on. With that said, I'd like to turn to our panelists for today for some opening remarks, and then we'll dive into questions. A number of you have already submitted questions as you registered for this event, and those have been captured and organized, and we'll try to get to them. I have some questions, and then don't hesitate to also use the question answer feature here to ask questions as well. We have 1 hour for this program. We'll try to get to as many questions as possible, but recognize that the situation is fluid. We may not be able to answer every question, and there may be a second part to this conversation in a week or so. That said, Susan, please take the floor.
Great, Sam, thanks for convening this and for inviting me to be part of it. As I was reflecting on what we would discuss today, I was thinking that often people imagine that signatures of agreements are a moment for celebration. And I think that we should in fact be thinking about a moment of soberness, because inevitably I think it provokes questions of why was there violence in the first place, of deep uncertainty about what comes next, of fears of what the next steps will look like. And it's very difficult for people not to try to situate themselves in whether it is a victory or a defeat, or what is won and what is lost. And I wanted to say this because I think when I talk to colleagues in different parts of the country and the region, I have a sense that people are in a bit of shock, and that what came was somewhat unexpected. And I wanted to say that I think that's normal when negotiations happen, particularly when they happen in secret, which is typically the case, and when you move to a space where there's something more public. And I think people are grappling with what are their expectations versus what is delivered, the uncertainty of why certain provisions were agreed, how they will be implemented, what they mean, the degree of commitment of parties, and the lack of trust. So even if something is on paper and in black and white, it's hard to imagine what it would look like in actual implementation. And then finally, just this notion that it introduces a moment where there needs or there can be a fundamental shift of thinking from organizing to stop the violence, to get humanitarian assistance, to try to get the country back on track, to organizing around what's in the agreement, and to imagine what life looks like that's different. So maybe I'll just close with opening remarks on the kind of 5 things that I think about when I read an agreement as I'm looking at something, because I think very few of us really have the privilege of being able to either accept or reject a document, right? That happens in diplomacy, but for most of us, that's not a privilege that we have. So first, I look at what are the principles that are agreed, and I try to look at those and imagine them in the long term, and abstract it out of the current moment. Then I try to look at what are the processes or the steps that are laid out. Ideally, there's often a calendar. If there's not, there are lots of clues in there. Then I try to understand what's said and what's unsaid, and what really remains to be agreed and defined. And then where are the opportunities for people to set priorities, to participate, to share their views where they see that things are missing. And I think that's really important, that it is a moment for people to talk about what they expect. And then finally, I try to think about what's possible outside of the agreement itself. Often agreements will create some space, either because of a temporary halt in fighting or the mobilization and the momentum that develops out of it. So just wanted to share those maybe as sort of initial frameworks as I look at a document, in this case for Ethiopia, but more broadly in other peace agreements.
Thank you, Susan. Alex?
Thank you. That was very helpful. I just want to add just a couple of comments on top of that. We tend to analyze peace agreements essentially as zero sum, and so if one side has gained, the other side has lost, and that is the assessment that is made. And then looking at context, we also tend to say, what is the shared vision in this? And the shared set of values and projected common future. And one of the striking things about the document that was signed in Pretoria earlier this week is it doesn't really give us an indication of that, which makes me look at the other context here, which is the context of a people, the Tigrayan people, threatened with extermination, with the crime of extermination committed on a scale that we have not seen anywhere in the world for decades, and the fact that the fact that we have an Ethiopian state that is running on empty, insofar as it has not collapsed, it is really only sustained by the habit of Ethiopians of maintaining respect for the state. So insofar as the key protagonists on both sides have a shared interest, it is a shared interest in avoiding oblivion. And so it's not, insofar as it's a positive sum, it's avoiding a collective disaster. And I think we need to ask ourselves, taking a big step back from the immediate situation, how is this agreement a first step or a crucial step on that, towards that shared, what we hope is a shared goal of avoiding that collective calamity, not only for the people of Tigray, but also for the state of Ethiopia?
Thank you, Alex. Josh?
Yeah, thanks, Sam, and thanks to everyone who tuned in. I'll be very brief because there's so much to get to here. Just a couple quick observations. We're obviously here to analyze this agreement, and that's exceedingly important, right? Like, we have to understand what's in it and what it says. But I always want to caution people that there is no perfect agreement, of course, and there are always going to be insufficiencies in any agreement. What really matters is the will of the people who have signed on to these agreements to actually see it through, and the will of those who they represent to support that process. That is, to me, what is critical about probably all agreements, and certainly peace agreements. They have to be undertaken in good faith. And so that is a big question mark for me, is what is the level of sincerity here? But we can certainly get into that in a little bit. And then just a few other things that are on my mind is that, again, this is a hugely important document. It only addresses one of the conflicts that are ongoing in Ethiopia right now. There's terrible fighting in Oromia, and in other parts. There's violence all across the country, actually, and not just between the government and armed rebel groups, but also among communities and even within communities. So I think we need to bear that in mind as well. And then, to me, finally, the very big, overwhelming question is, how do you, after such a ruinous conflict that was so brutal and so comprehensive, how do you put the social fabric back together? How do you rebuild after so much suffering on all sides? I do not have any sort of answer there, but that is something that Ethiopians themselves, of course, will have to do and will have to think a lot about. So I'll leave it right there.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you to all three of you for your opening remarks. Susan, we'll start with you with the first question. What is a cessation of hostilities, and how does that differ from a ceasefire? There's a lot of confusion right now as to what just happened, what was signed, and part of it, I believe, is because people use these terms interchangeably, and certainly even in the media, and so it's very easy to confuse the two. But you've seen these before. What is the difference?
Thanks, Sam. So I would say that the terms are used interchangeably and probably differently in different contexts. But generally speaking, we think about these along a continuum, with a truce being perhaps, or a unilateral truce being the most informal, with the lowest level of commitments, the lowest level of detail, moving towards a cessation of hostilities, and then a ceasefire, which is sometimes talked about as a permanent ceasefire, with the greatest level of commitment. And I might even extend it out, because often a component of a ceasefire and the agreement surrounding it will address specific questions related to security sector governance, reform, modernization. We use lots of different terms to talk about it at this point. But a cessation of hostilities is usually at the beginning of a peace process, and so signals further discussions. Typically will precede some political negotiations in order to silence the guns for a period of agreed time and under agreed conditions, to allow space for discussion, both on the longer term cessation and other matters that need to be addressed in it. A ceasefire typically is negotiated, has details about how weapons and troops are redeployed, sets very particular parameters that can be monitored and reported against, and ideally has a mechanism for addressing violations. This is also true in a cessation of hostilities as well, to have some sort of monitoring and verification mechanism. And I think what has emerged in some of the better practice in all monitoring and verification is to ensure that there's a capacity to also de-escalate, right? It's not uncommon that there will be violations, or there will be tensions and conflicts that arise. And part of a strong peace agreement is to have a mechanism to actually de-escalate those before they tip into violence, and to ensure that they're actually anchored into communities.
So, one of the things that we've talked a lot about is sequencing, with peace talks, and that sort of gets me to my next question with Josh. What is your immediate reaction to this agreement? Some would argue that it goes further than what a typical cessation of hostilities looks like, and that there are or maybe provisions and deadlines in it that are just unworkable, that are unrealistic, no matter what the demands or aspirations of either party are?
Yeah, my first reaction was a sense of mild hope, maybe, and because this war has been so awful and so pointless that anything that suggested progress towards peace, it was hard for me not to feel some sense of hope, as I said, and relief. Although it's nothing compared to the sense of relief and hope that people who are actually suffering from this potentially felt. So that was my initial reaction. There are things in it, yes, that are going to be extraordinarily difficult. In fact, I'm not sure how some of these provisions, it's even possible physically to achieve some of the stipulated timelines. Disarmament is the big obvious one, 30 days to be for the TDF to be entirely disarmed. That would require not only an extraordinary amount of coordination with forces that are scattered all over Tigray, but it would also require that the guarantor of Tigray's security, the ENDF, be in position in the places it needs to be to guarantee that security. It would also require that Eritrean forces are outside of Tigray, and any Fano or other non-Tigrayan forces are outside. That, again, just from a simple logistics perspective, is going to be extraordinarily difficult, not to mention the difficulty of sequencing this properly, and just of achieving the level of trust that would be necessary for the TDF, for instance, to disarm. And the fact that the enemy that has been the TDF's primary antagonist, or one of the primary antagonists, is now responsible for security in Tigray. So this alone is an extraordinarily difficult part of the ceasefire now, or of the cessation of hostilities. Now, there are always going to be these sorts of difficulties. So, perhaps they can be overcome. I'm not trying to pour cold water on this. I'm skeptical that we will see this in 30 days. There are other problems here. Obviously, the Amhara were not present at these negotiations, and we've already seen statements from Amhara leadership decrying that fact and expressing their resolve not to relinquish any parts of Western Tigray, the Wolkite and Raya areas. And so that's going to be an extraordinarily difficult issue to work through. And the cessation doesn't really address it. It makes some ambiguous, stipulations around borders and such, but it does not address this deep problem. And then even some of the language within the cessation, there was frequent invocations of the Constitution and how these things will be resolved according to constitutional means. Well, people disagree about what the Constitution says about some of these things. And some groups, again, I'll go back to the Amhara here, they really disagree with the Constitution itself. So again, there's always going to be these sorts of problems in any ceasefire or cessation of hostilities or any sort of peace agreement. These are big ones, and it's going to take, again, people very deeply committed to really seeing a genuine peace take hold to achieve this.
Thanks, Josh. You mentioned a very important player in this war, Eritrea, which was not mentioned at all on Wednesday in the statement, the agreement, or in the press conference. Alex, my next question is to you. Eritrea is a key player in this war. It's a significant stakeholder in the fighting, and some would argue that it needs to be part of the peace process, either included in the peace process willingly, or its removal be agreed upon by the Tigrayan and Ethiopian leaders. So the word Eritrea does not appear in this agreement, but the word foreign does. It's ambiguous, but I think we can all assume or interpret what that means. But this is a sticking point for Tigrayans, both in Tigray and in the diaspora. So what do you make of this? And how is a peace process supposed to be credible or permanent without the withdrawal of the Eritrean military?
I think the first point to make is that the Eritrean military has been fully committed to this war, and not only fully committed to this war, but fully committed to the military objective of capturing Mekelle before a cessation of hostilities came into effect. So even this morning, the Eritrean military was on the offensive. Yesterday, it was doing everything it could to break the defensive lines near Adigrat and near Halcyon. It failed, and apparently the guns only fell silent a couple of hours ago. The Ethiopian guns fell silent this morning. They were fighting yesterday. They weren't fighting today. So the Eritreans did not achieve that objective, and I think it is now going to be very difficult for them to achieve it, both because they haven't made the progress they expected to on the ground, and also because now the spotlight is going to be upon them. So in the very limited sense of stopping that Eritrean onslaught, which was making progress, the cessation of hostilities has achieved that goal. The question then is given that so much of the Eritrean army is committed to this war and is actually deep inside Tigray, what then happens? Can and will Abiy remove them? Well, earlier this year, he made some efforts to do that. It's not clear whether they were in good faith. It's not clear if he was able to achieve his goal in the short term, even if he wanted to. And clearly, he reversed any commitments that he might then have made. But I think the key point here, and this actually relates to a number of the issues that Josh was raising, is that the military commanders are due to meet on Monday to work out the implementation modalities. And the implementation modalities for any type of security arrangements are very complex and time-consuming to negotiate. And presumably, the reason why an implementation matrix was not included in the document that was signed earlier this week was simply to have gone through the detailed requirements in terms of timelines, in terms of maps, in terms of reporting, etc. Would just have taken too long. The individuals who were required for such a negotiation were not on hand. You need a full team of military officers who are positioned in their respective militaries to work this out, and those people were simply not there in Pretoria. So those negotiations are due to begin next week, and that on that agenda is also monitoring and verification, because the monitoring and verification mechanism in the existing agreement is vapid. It's not really there at all. So something much more robust will be needed. Now, the reason I raise this is because if you look at the document itself, that document is not the foundation for a proper peace. It is a gesture of intent. So where is the foundation? And the foundation in peace talks is typically something that is agreed, which is not on paper. And we don't know what that is, but we have a clue in the indication that the military measures all the way through to disarmament and demobilization and reintegration, I'll come to that word reintegration in a moment, those are to be decided jointly. And the reality on the ground is that any action can only be implemented on the ground jointly by consent. You cannot do it against the will of the parties, and they both know that. And that includes the removal of the Eritreans. But also let me return to that point, reintegration. Reintegration in DDR can mean two things. It can mean reintegration into civilian life and reintegration into the military. Now, what we don't know is what, if any, commitment there was for reintegrating those Tigrayan officers and soldiers back into the ENDF. It's a question mark. And I'll just leave it at that, because if we shift our focus to the negotiations next week, we may see a slightly different pattern emerging.
Thank you, Alex. one of the things that Josh mentioned that I want to ask you, Susan, is around the lack of inclusion of others. The Amhara advocates in the United States, the Amhara Association of America, Amhara leaders in the Amhara region and elsewhere are advocating to be included in these talks. Why do you think that for this stage of a cessation of hostilities, it made sense for the Tigrayan and Ethiopian negotiating teams to work together as opposed to having sort of a big tent approach? But then also, you've done a lot of work sort of on dialogue processes and what that looks like. What could the next steps be? How do you bring others into the fold? Does this cessation of hostilities move into a ceasefire? Does that move into some sort of national inclusive dialogue? Does that move into some sort of constitutional convention of some sorts to take a look at some of the broader, more complicated issues? As Josh mentioned, a lot of Amharas don't even agree with the constitution. So upholding Ethiopia's constitutional order could be objectionable in that perspective.
Yes, the question of who to include and how to sequence different steps, I think, is really complex and complicated. And I think, as both Alex and Josh have alluded to here, and people have raised in the questions, what we see is it seems like it's a bit of a hybrid between what would typically be, or what has been in other contexts, a declaration of principles, right? An articulation of the broad set of agreements that parties agree to work towards, plus a cessation of hostilities, plus some parameters of what will go into a permanent ceasefire, plus a signal for some sort of mechanism for broader political dialogue for the country. And I think we have to read this also knowing that the Prime Minister announced a national dialogue facilitation commission has been appointed, is carrying out pre-preparatory work and consultations about shape and form. And I think one of the question marks and the discussions that will have to happen amongst Ethiopians is how do these processes meet, and how do they fit together? And how do decisions and commitments that are made as part of silencing the guns and keeping the guns silent and making sure that people can live together in the sort of geographic delimitation that's been set out in this agreement, how do those impact or constrain decisions that might come at a later stage? I mean, Sam, on the question about inclusion of other regions and other communities and political entities into the conversation for a cessation or for a ceasefire discussion, I mean, I would first say that my starting assumption is always that negotiators and heads of governments or heads of opposition or armed groups are having to negotiate the interests of anybody who is within their coalition, right? Or anybody for whom they're responsible governing. That is, I think, a basic political tenet, right? You can't walk in and negotiate something that you don't think that you can sell back. Or if you're doing it, it's because you have to have a very compelling strategic reason and a set of information that maybe we don't all have the privilege of knowing. And so I would say that one of the other challenges right now is that there is this mix between holding leaders and negotiators and people who sign agreements accountable for commitments they make and the representation and the inclusion of communities and groups and young people and old people and men and women who were largely absent from this negotiation, almost entirely absent, with acknowledging that the people who sign the deal have to bring their broader groups and constituencies along and are always calculating what is necessary to do that. And I think recognizing that requires trust in individuals. And I think we can safely say that there is not mutual trust across because of the experiences that people have had in all aspects of this violence and conflict. And that's part of what emerges in a negotiation, right? Is how do you demonstrate and show that trust? I'll just say one of the things that I find most interesting in this agreement is the articulation, the explicit articulation of confidence building measures. And it strikes me that people will be watching very closely whether those are implemented or not. It's nice to say words, but what people will be assessed on in their seriousness and commitment is actions that are taken.
Thank you, Susan. Josh, a question for you around the role of the African Union and the role of the United States in this process. So Susan's organization, the U.S. Institute of Peace, right before the war broke out, had released a report and recommendations from the Horn of Africa and Red Sea Arena Senior Study Group. One of the recommendations that the study group had put together or put forward rather, is the establishment of a special envoy for the Horn of Africa. That role was established eventually by the State Department, and in about a year and a half, we've seen 3 different envoys in that role. But there seems to be some issues that people have raised, whether it's in Washington or elsewhere, around the role, the effectiveness of that role, and the effectiveness of the African Union as the continental body, which in 2016 pledged to silence the guns throughout the continent by 2020. Yet conflict continues in multiple parts of the continent. So what do you make of this? There's been a lot of frustration with the AU, but they facilitated the talks these past 2 weeks with enormous backing from the United States, the United Nations, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development. But is that dynamic going to hold? And what do you make of their performance thus far?
Yeah, this is a hard one to answer because we still don't know a lot of the details, of course, of what went on in Pretoria. It does seem that the AU outperformed, admittedly, very low expectations of its abilities to negotiate or facilitate this sort of negotiation. Throughout the conflict, and especially since the AU became the recognized point organization on facilitating negotiations, the report card has been pretty poor. It was widely considered that the AU was a bit irrelevant to the process, that they were included, but a lot of the serious, meaningful conversations happened elsewhere or around the AU. But again, the AU was clearly a significant part of what happened in Pretoria. So I give it, maybe premature and certainly with some hesitation, I give it some credit here. Perhaps more details will come out and we know that it wasn't particularly helpful, or maybe it was even more helpful than we thought. So, I have to heavily caveat all of that. The United States has been criticized on all sides, including by me, for its activities throughout the conflict, or its lack of action throughout the conflict in some cases. I do think that it made a really honest effort in the Djibouti and Seychelles talks, and those made some progress. Now, ultimately they failed, but I wonder if what happened there laid the groundwork for what happened in Pretoria. I don't know. Again, this is something probably historians will have to tell us some years from now. But, and it's no doubt that the U.S. was pushing very, very hard in Pretoria on all parties to get to something that was workable. Now, I have some misgivings about putting a lot of pressure on people to negotiate, because as one of the very first things I said during this webinar was that the success of these negotiations depend on the good faith and the determination of the negotiators to actually see it through. So if you're simply pressuring them to the table and they sign something only because they're under international pressure, it's not going to work. South Sudan is the classic example of this. I don't know how many negotiations we've had there that have failed entirely because the people signing those things were only doing it to get the international community off their backs for a brief amount of time. And then they went on their merry way to continue their fighting. So, pressure is necessary. It has to be wielded wisely and judiciously. I'm sorry to hedge so much on this, but I still think we're going to have to wait a bit to know how effective really was the diplomacy from the United States, from the African Union, from the others. It looks like it was fairly effective so far, but TBD, I think.
Thanks, Josh. Alex, so we have a question for you from Kara Anna from the Associated Press. What are the negotiators telling you about next steps, especially on monitoring, since allegations of attacks continue? And are there timeframes for the resumption of basic services and aid delivery that are agreed upon, but for some reason weren't spelled out in the deal? I just want to add to this, Dr. Gebru the head of Eider Hospital in Mekelle, the largest hospital in Tigray, tweeted out earlier today that they still haven't received any aid deliveries. I have checked in with him and others who have said the same, that security clearances haven't been granted yet. So what's the holdup? And have you seen this in other conflicts? What do you make of this?
Well, first of all, the negotiations in South Africa were incredibly secretive, and the negotiators on both sides, and most particularly on the Tigray side, were entirely sealed off from communication, and the mediators themselves said next to nothing, and the observers, that is the UN, IGAD, and the US, were also almost entirely shut out, and the EU was shut out entirely. So it was a remarkably closed process, and I, in terms of knowing what was going on, knowing what the expectations are, it's very much, reading the tea leaves, just trying to use one's intuition to infer what might have happened. I don't have any specific knowledge. On the point of aid, I think it's a terrible failure of the internationals not to have had planes arriving in Mekelle with insulin, with essential medicines, with basic medical supplies on the day after. Well, why was UN OCHA unable to say, okay, this deal was signed, the guns are supposed to fall silent on midnight on Wednesday night? Shouldn't they have been flying these essential supplies in? Are they not available? It would be, if nothing else, of course, it's not going to turn the humanitarian crisis around, but it would be a tremendously important symbolic act just to say this means something. Because with every day that goes past and people continue to die needlessly, the credibility of this agreement and the men, and of course they are all men who negotiated it, is going to be eroding.
Definitely. I thank you for mentioning the men piece. I was going to get to that later, but I'll ask that now, actually. It is often said in war that women and children suffer the most, and certainly the case in this war, but also young men have suffered. There have been reports from Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch and others of young men of fighting age being massacred, just for being of a certain age. Both teams had all-male delegations. The leaders of both governments on the Tigrayan and Ethiopian sides are men. At least one of the three AU mediators was a woman, who remarked at the press conference on Wednesday that at least one of the negotiating sides told her that they pledged to have at least one or more women in their teams for future talks. But this sort of all-male effort, frankly, frustrates me often. And the level of testosterone, I do believe, does contribute to conflict, the saber rattling that we saw even before the war began. What do you three make of all of this? And how do we include more women in the process? Josh, you mentioned South Sudan earlier. In that case, too, it is two men who are leading a lot of the fighting. Susan, you at USIP in your Africa program, you have a woman in conflict program that looks at these issues. So we'd love to hear from the three of you briefly on the gender dynamics, not only of the negotiating teams, but of the war in general.
Let me just make one point, which is actually to point you to this poster I have on my wall. Don't be ashamed to stand for peace. And one of the problems with Ethiopia is that when one side says we want peace, the other side must always think, oh, that's because you're weak. And that sort of culture of bravado is deeply problematic. I'll just leave it at that.
Josh, did I jump in?
Go ahead, please.
I mean, it strikes me that as the next phases of the conversation go forward, it's essential to include women. And I think it's women in both the negotiating teams and women for their perspective on what's happening in their communities and how people are being most impacted by the conflict and what are the ways out and forward. And I will underline here, this is a personal view, but that sometimes women are included in conversations on women's issues or issues related to women. And in my mind, those are all the issues. It's not just one issue and it's not isolated and it's one point. Look, we know and there's research that peace agreements are more effective and longer lasting when women are at the table. The data tells us that. We know that leaders sign agreements and that people have to implement them. And more than 50% of people are women. And so there has to be a way to include meaningfully women in the tables that come forward. I'll also say that I think there's often a sense that including women isn't necessary in the kind of hard military security arrangements that are negotiated often at the very beginning, whether it's for a cessation of hostilities or a ceasefire. And I would make the case that any decisions about how troops are being deployed or redeployed, about what monitoring and verification mechanisms are, what are reporting structures, who are members of verification teams who can actually go and talk and hear from people who are most impacted by conflict. Women have views on that. And so I think it is really incumbent on the negotiating teams to look to the women in their ranks. I mean, in the Ethiopian government, there are tremendous women who are sitting in positions, and the government has I think made a point of including women in senior level posts. I'm sure that this is also true and available for Tigrayan authorities, whatever constellation is actually negotiating. But I think, Sam, this also touches on a point about how do negotiations start to open up more broadly for participation, right? There's the people who sit at the table and make the decisions, but then there's the people who are deeply impacted by those decisions and want to feed into them. And both of those mechanisms for inclusion are really important. And hopefully, with some sort of preliminary agreements set, there is an opportunity to build out that broader participation, that broader inclusion, because I think if it's added in later, it makes the work that much harder.
Yeah, I think Susan and Alex covered it very, very well. So I'll just briefly say that it's well documented, Sam, what you referenced, that in virtually every war, it is not combatants who die the most, it is civilians. That this is one of the horrors of war. We don't want to overlook, obviously, all the combatants themselves who've died. That has been genuinely tragic as well, but this mostly falls on women, children, old men. Those are the people who suffer the most usually in wars. So to me, that means though you have to have that perspective included in negotiations of this sort. And it's not, we don't want women there so the parties can burnish their feminist credentials or something. That's not what we're talking about. We're like, they have to be there because they are critical to the process. For it to be sustainable, many millions of people are going to have to participate, and that will include many, many women, obviously, to make this successful. So that is a reality, and I hope that the parties, as this process moves forward, they really take that to heart and try to bring more women and other voices, not just women, but other underrepresented voices, minority communities within Tigray, for instance, and other places.
Thank you all. Susan, my next question is to you. It's from an anonymous attendee. It ties on the point that you were making earlier around sequencing talks and how do you get to a big tent conversation. So the agreement that was signed has a provision that directs the TPLF to not support any other armed groups in the country. One can interpret that as also being targeted towards the Oromo Liberation Army, which the Tigray forces and the Oromo Liberation Army have a pact. And so what do you make of that, sort of building on your point that these two parties or any parties to a cessation of hostilities have to keep in mind their allies when they're negotiating?
Yeah, well, like Alex said, I think none of us had the privilege or the responsibility of sitting in the room, and so we're operating on what we see from the outside and what we can glean from other circumstances. I think for a government, it would be a very normal provision to indicate that an armed opposition would not provide material or other support to other armed groups. I don't think that that's something that's outside the realm of normal or typical in a peace agreement. But as you know, it obviously has significant political implications for some of the coalitions and for the broader conversation about peace and governance and how the country moves forward for Ethiopia. So my best assumption would be that there was hopefully some level of communication at some stage between the OLA and those who were negotiating. And if it didn't happen already, it will likely be happening in earnest at the moment. And part of those conversations will need to be about thinking through where can other groups be on-ramped, is kind of the term that we talk about, into discussions about the future of the country. And I think there's the fact that there is a national dialogue that is announced, and where I think there's broad consensus that a national dialogue needs to take place. What isn't agreed is under what conditions and how different political and social forces need to participate and need to ensure their participation. So I think this is something that will have to be discussed. And I would say to those who are worried about it and thinking about it, be imaginative about what these mechanisms look like, right? And that when we look at other places in the region, we know that bringing other groups into nonviolent means of having political dialogue, it takes a lot of time. And it takes addressing both people's fears, their incentives, their aspirations, and having some dedicated focus on different constituencies and what they're representing.
Thank you. So we have about 5 or so minutes left. Laura Brisbane has a question. What are the prospects for a meaningful transitional justice process following a more comprehensive settlement agreement? I don't know if any of you want to take that. What does transitional justice actually look like?
The provision in the agreement is very, very weak. It puts this responsibility only on the shoulders of the Ethiopian government. And on past record, that is a way of having the issue not addressed. So I wouldn't be very optimistic.
Thank you. So another question from Bitzer Zeman. Given that there have been airstrikes after the agreement went into effect, does this mean it's already voided, essentially? Do actual cessations of hostilities normally happen right away, or is it expected that some fighting continues for a while? And sort of building on this point, I think, Susan, you mentioned earlier around the monitoring and verification mechanism as well, that there are some issues with that. So I don't know if all three of you want to take this or go ahead.
Maybe I could. Okay, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say quickly on the initial part of that question. I don't think it means the cessation is dead. The airstrikes mean the cessation is dead. I normally expect that there will be some residual violence, may I say, after such things are signed, because you still have forces in the field, sometimes in contact with one another. And command and control is always difficult, even among very highly disciplined armies. But in this situation where communication alone is hard because of the shutdown of communications in the region, where you have armies with varying levels of discipline, I expect, frankly, that there will be these sorts of incidents, and there may well be in the future also, because any single commander could touch off an incident, and you have forces in close proximity like this. So part of the challenge is getting those forces away from each other, so no one person can take matters into his own hands, or there isn't an accidental exchange because patrols run into each other by accident or something there. So that's part of the challenge here. Is you got to get those forces away from each other. You have to ensure that they are under strong command and control. These are big tasks.
I would give a slightly different answer to that. I think everything you say is true, and I think some of the accounts that we've had over the last 36 hours of skirmishes with Amhara special forces and militia and so on, are clearly that. What we had with the attacks on Zalambasa, on the Adwa Halcyon front, and the air raids are something different. And what those indicate is that the command and control is in Asmara, and that Asmara has continues until at least today to have command and control over not only the Eritrean forces but also elements of the Ethiopian National Defense Forces, including the Air Force. So which is a different issue. That's not an accidental thing. That is something that needs to be dealt with at source. And I trust that those in a position of authority and with leverage are going to call out those violations.
Susan, question for you from Akwilu Reda around the determination of genocide, ethnic cleansing, and transitional justice. The United States State Department has a atrocity determination report that they've kept secret. The UN International Commission of Human Rights Experts on Ethiopia alleged that all sides committed war crimes, went a step further, alleging that the Ethiopian government committed crimes against humanity. There's a strong assertion by a lot of advocates that genocide has taken place. Where does that lie in the transitional justice process? Because one of the challenges with these processes, and I know we're running out of time, one of the challenges with these processes is you have to balance how much peace and justice and accountability do you have? So what do you make of that?
Yeah, these are really hard questions because we talk about them in these abstract terms and policy language, but they relate to humans and people and family members, and I think that's always difficult to address. I mean, what strikes me is that in the objectives in the agreement, there is a commitment to have a framework to ensure accountability for matters arising out of the conflict, so that in theory can be leveraged and built upon to address some of the accountability questions. And then there's also a recognition related to reconciliation and rehabilitation of social bonds. It's and the specific reference to the African Union's transitional justice policy. I think that this is something that's going to require much more conversation, and there will need to be a specific conversation related to this phase of the conflict, but also other things that have happened and continue to happen around the country. And frankly, I don't think Ethiopia has really had the space to meaningfully grapple with its past. And my sense is that the absence of that shared narrative of the past 30 years, and then even bridging back into past phases of violence, really was fuel on top of the fire that was taking place now. And so in my mind, we want to ensure that guns are silenced and people can be fed and taken care of. But importantly, no one wants to see Ethiopia back in this place in another 10 or 15 or 20 or 30 years. And so figuring out a meaningful mechanism for that transitional justice will be, I think, absolutely critical.
So we've run out of time for today. There's a lot of questions in the in the audience that I hope we can get to in a future conversation. All questions are equally important and meaningful. We just only have 60 minutes for this conversation today. As I said at the start of this conversation, the peace process is extremely fluid. There are ongoing talks happening. We will see what happens over the next week or two, and hopefully we can reconvene this panel for maybe a longer conversation on these issues and dive deeper as we learn more and as the title suggests, as we understand the Ethiopia-Tigrai peace process. But I want to thank Susan, Alex, Josh for your time today, for your insights, and just note again to the audience, thank you so much for your questions and your participation. We can't get to all of them in the 1 hour that we have, but every question is equal, is valuable, and I do hope that in a future conversation we can dive deeper on some of these other issues as well. At the end of the day, no one wants to see peace, or excuse me, no one wants to see war in Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa. This is a region that has seen a lot of conflict over the past century, and the time has come for not only there to be a credible, inclusive, and permanent peace process, but for communities to thrive and to be whole again. So, I do thank the three of you for your work on this issue every day. Your insight, your expertise is enormously important, and for the time that you've provided today. So this recording will go live on YouTube in a bit, and we will reconvene soon. And may the peace process bear into fruition. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day and have a great weekend.